Hey guys, welcome back to another video. In today's video, we continue down our list of the 50 best horror movies that you've never seen, with number 49 on the list, number 48 for us, When a Stranger Calls. When a Stranger Calls came out in 1979, and there actually is a remake that came out in 2006. For a quick synopsis of the movie, it's about a babysitter who, while babysitting two children, keeps getting mysterious phone calls from an unknown man. The man keeps asking, "Have you checked on the children?" And after each phone call, seems to get more angry that the babysitter hasn't checked on the children yet. She ends up calling the police, who actually trace the phone call and let her know that the killer is inside the house. By the time the police get there, the two children are upstairs, murdered in their beds, and the babysitter just narrowly escapes. The movie picks up 7 years later after the killer has been caught and sentenced to an insane asylum. He's gone through rigorous testing but does ultimately escape. And one interesting thing I did find out while researching this movie is that this concept is actually based on a true story. On March 18th in 1950, 13-year-old Janet Christman was actually calling the police, frantically screaming, and they were unable to get her to tell them their location and what was going on. She was just crying and screaming hysterically and then ended up hanging up. The parents returned home around 1:30 a.m. to find Janet dead. It was actually found that someone had been harassing her and a killer came in and killed the babysitter. I was not able to find if the children were harmed, but this kind of fear really sparked this idea of the babysitter versus the murderer, which you see in movies like this one, you see it in movies like Scream, and in Halloween with Michael Myers. The first 20 minutes of this movie actually has one of the most iconic scenes in horror movie history. It's one of the most genuinely terrifying because it's so simple and so effective. Like I said, it starts out with our babysitter getting calls while babysitting these two children of someone asking her, have you checked on the children? Why haven't you checked on the children? Some phone calls, he just breathes and hangs up, other times actually having conversation with the babysitter, Jill. The entire time, Jill never goes and checks on the children, staying downstairs and just terrified out of her mind, assuming the person is outside looking into the house at her. Now, this beginning shot is beautifully done. Every time she is on the phone, you can kind of see the staircase that goes upstairs to the children's room behind her. You're always kind of expecting something to come lurking out of the darkness. It's very good and very suspenseful, and people who have seen this movie praise this scene. Now, the interesting thing about this killer is he actually only murders two people. It is the two children from the beginning of the movie. He actually breaks into the house, finds them asleep in their bed, and decides to kill them. No weapon is used, and in the movie it is said that the children were so brutally dismembered that the coroner said it would take 4 hours to reconstruct them to the point where the families could recognize them. And while other killers seem to have a higher body count, just the fact of mutilating two innocent children this badly does make this man seem way more scary than anyone else. Now, the hardest thing I kind of had with this movie is the fact that it feels kind of disjointed in the way that it's presented. The first 20 minutes is so iconic and so drilled into people's brains that you kind of forget that there's even a second part of the movie. The killer is, like I said, he goes into an asylum, he ends up being under rigorous treatment, and then actually ends up escaping. But it almost feels like his escape is a whole separate movie. It almost feels like it's even shot differently. It doesn't have the same type of suspense and build-up like the first scene did. And this was really my biggest beef with the entire movie. I almost felt like I was watching two different movies that were kind of strewn into one. And after doing some research about this, I actually found that a lot of people feel the same way. That this movie feels like two different movies, or that it feels almost like out of place, or like the story doesn't flow how you would expect it to. And there's actually a reason why this movie kind of feels this way. Fred Walton, who is the director, had actually written and directed a short called The Sitter, which plays out almost exactly how you see the first 20 minutes of this movie. But after seeing the success of the Halloween movies and how Michael Myers escaped the asylum and kind of goes on another killing rampage, he felt like his short, The Sitter, could be pushed a little bit more and kind of become almost like another Michael Myers. And while I understand this reasoning to try to extend this from going from a short to a full-length movie, I do feel like this kind of causes a little bit of a disconnect in the way that the two parts of the movie kind of line up. Like I said, they feel like two different movies, and it's almost because that they are. Walton didn't originally write that first beginning scene anticipating on you to kind of learn about the killer afterwards, which may be why it kind of feels like it's not set up correctly. I almost feel like it's got all the right pieces for a really good movie, but just put in the wrong order. Now, I will say Tony Beckley, who plays Kurt Duncan, the killer, does a beautiful job at portraying a weak, kind of scared, fragile man. And it actually is reported that Beckley was really sick during the shooting of this movie and died shortly after, making this the last film that Beckley is a part of. But apparently Beckley and Walton were pretty good friends, and Walton really wanted Beckley to be a part of this movie, and Beckley, being his friend, didn't want to let him down. But Beckley also had real big confidence issues in real life, not just in this movie. Carol Kane, who plays Jill the babysitter in this movie, was a huge upcoming actress at the time. She actually still acts in TV shows and stuff today. And her acting, honestly, in the later parts of the movie where she's playing the distressed mother is so realistic and so believable. I really do give her props for her acting in this movie. And it's actually reported that Beckley started to feel really insecure compared to Carol. And this was kind of eating away at him and making him not want to be a part of the movie as much. So Beckley, kind of being sick and really feeling not confident, was really struggling throughout the filming of this movie. And I do feel like you kind of get a sense of that vulnerable man in the way that he portrays himself as Kurt Duncan. And the movie Black Christmas actually came out in 1974, and it's actually number 1 on the list of 50 best horror movies that you've never seen. This movie also takes place with a killer inside the house harassing a group of babysitters. And this movie actually tears a line from that film word for word. When the police call Jill back after the phone call that they traced and let her know that the calls are coming from inside the house, that line is actually stolen directly from the Black Christmas movie. So the idea of the babysitter having to fight off a killer that's coming from inside the house is not a new one, but this movie is the one that kind of made that scene iconic. And the movie Scream that came out later in the 90s actually pays homage to this movie, When a Stranger Calls. Now, as much as I love the beginning, as I've said over and over again, I do feel like the rest of the movie is kind of disconnected. One of my biggest issues I have with the rest of the movie is how slow these scenes seem to play out. There are minute-long scenes of people just walking down the street or doing kind of mundane things that I know is supposed to be building tension and suspense, but it almost feels like it goes on so long that you're like, can someone please pop out already? Geez. And because of this, I kind of found myself getting bored halfway through, and I would kind of lose interest or start looking off and thinking about other things, and I'd be like, oh, let me focus on this movie, which isn't a good sign for a horror movie, because the more your audience kind of pulls away because things are taking too long, the less scared they're going to be when the actual action happens. And the beginning was so intense and scary, and everything was timed so nicely that it really feels kind of like this movie was shot by a different person in some points. And another issue I had was with the storyline with Tracy. Tracy is a character that is just in a bar, she's having a drink, having a smoke, and Kurt Duncan, after shortly escaping, kind of becomes infatuated with her. He ends up actually following her home, almost kind of breaking into her house. He does end up hiding out in her house later, and the detective that's looking for Duncan does kind of communicate with Tracy, and he starts to kind of watch over Tracy to see if the guy's going to come back, because she's like, oh, he was in my house, he's followed me home, am I in danger? So it's this whole middle part of the movie that ultimately does nothing to move the plot along. Yes, it does help the detective kind of get eyes on Kurt, but the detective ends up finding Duncan in a homeless shelter asleep in a bed. And Tracy doesn't know that he's going there. She has no idea where he's gone. So it's this whole middle thing where Duncan gets obsessed with this new woman just for him not to kill her and for her not to help find the killer. So after watching the movie and kind of realizing that even if Tracy's character didn't exist, they still would have found Duncan the exact same way, kind of made me realize that this movie wasn't paced the way that I thought it should be. And it's stuff like that that definitely makes us feel like it went from a movie short that worked really well to stretched out way too long to become an actual movie. And I really feel like this could have been super successful as just being a short. And it also could be successful as a feature-length movie, but I feel like it kind of needed to be rearranged a little differently, or maybe just a different story needs to be told. And after Duncan's detour with Tracy, where he doesn't really do anything to her, he actually ends up finding Jill. I think her name was in the newspaper. She was mentioned for something she did with work, and he ends up tracking her down that way. He calls her while she's at the restaurant with her husband, asking her, have you checked on the children? This puts her into immediate hysterics. She breaks down in the middle of the restaurant. It's very, very heart-wrenching to think of as someone who went through something so traumatic just 7 years earlier, who now is a mother of 2 children, and hears the voice of the person who killed 2 kids that she was in the house with. She ends up calling the house with the babysitter that she had hired, asking her, when was the last time you checked on my children? The babysitter said about 45 minutes ago, and they were fine. And Jill says, we're coming home immediately. They cut their dinner short and race home. Her children are still safe, but she is now traumatized. She has no idea where Duncan is at this point. He wasn't inside the house as far as they could tell, but she's really just kind of restless. She can't sleep that night. She's wandering around the house, and then things start to kind of happen. Like the power kind of goes out. She starts hearing noises, and as she's sitting in bed just kind of contemplating everything, she hears Duncan, and it sounds like he's coming from the closet, saying kind of creepy things like, "I can see you, but you can't see me." And when she kind of goes to get up to look into the closet, her husband rolls over to reveal that it's actually Duncan in bed with her, and he grabs at her arm and starts to attack her. Thankfully, at this point, the detective does come into the room and shoots Duncan twice, ultimately killing him, so we think. And the husband is found in the closet, kind of knocked out and dazed, but still alive. So Jill's husband and 2 children do survive the encounter, again making Duncan's kill count only the 2 children from the beginning of the movie. And I'm not saying that him murdering more people would make him more scary. It is not about the number of people he killed versus how he killed them. Again, he was said to have mutilated the children so badly that the coroners took hours to reconstruct them to a recognizable state. And to think of that happening to 2 innocent children is heart-wrenching and so distressing, especially for people who are mothers. I also know anyone who was actively babysitting at the time this movie came out were actually scared to start babysitting again, finding this movie very scary. And if I was to watch this as a 13-year-old kid, I would be terrified to go babysit for someone else's kids at that time. And as soon as the phone would ring, I would just be like in total panic mode. What's my favorite kill of this movie? It's kind of hard to say just because the 2 kills that did happen, we actually don't see. You only ever see flashbacks of Duncan hovering over the children covered in their blood. And it feels wrong to say my favorite deaths are of 2 innocent sleeping children, but when Duncan is shot, we don't actually know that he's dead. He's shot twice in the chest, and he's presumed dead, but the detective never actually checks for an active pulse, and there is a sequel to this movie, so it's kind of like, I can't count Duncan's death either, essentially, so I don't really have a favorite death for this film. It doesn't feel right to like the fact that 2 children got killed, and because Duncan is an unconfirmed death, and let's be honest, he was shot twice while on top of a woman, that's not really anything revolutionary. I really don't have a favorite death for this movie. Which is another interesting aspect of this movie. It doesn't show a lot of violence at all. Duncan does get beat up in a bar, and there's a couple of scuffles like that, but really none of the violence is really kind of portrayed or shown, giving this movie all the more reliance on the suspension and tension that it builds, which, like I said earlier, kind of gets thrown away with how long some of the shots seem to be kind of drug out. They don't really feel like they're set up in a way that's trying to build suspense. It's just a little bit hard to pay attention when you're watching characters do very mundane things. Like when Tracy first gets followed home by Duncan, it's a little bit intense because you know Duncan is following her. But the second time that we see the sequence of her walking home, Duncan's supposed to be following her, but we also know the detective's following her, and because she's taking the same path home, it feels like you're watching the same thing twice. And it's like almost 2 minutes long of her walking home. So to have 2 long sequences like that, within only a few minutes of each other, it just, again, makes this movie feel really slow and sluggish, and is really my biggest beef with this entire movie. Do I think it deserves to be on the list of the 50 best horror movies that you've never seen? I do, mainly because of that opening shot. That opening sequence is so scary that I think a lot of people should see it, even if it's the only part of the movie you watch. The other parts are good, like it's a good movie overall. It's just kind of be prepared to be a little bit bored at in the middle of it. The ending is really intense and scary once he actually finds Jill again. That's kind of when you're like, ooh, what's going to happen? But that middle part just is so slow, and it's kind of hard to keep yourself interested. That's the only reason I would say this movie shouldn't be on there, but that beginning scene really just wipes the slate clean for me. It's so good. And I haven't seen the sequel, and I've only seen bits and pieces of the 2006 version. I don't think I've actually watched it from start to finish. I definitely want to. I want to kind of see how it was remade and modified to see if they kind of still have this slow, weird middle part that kind of feels disconnected. And I do want to see the second one just to see what the sequel would be like for Duncan. I honestly don't know if he's even in the second movie. I know it was made in tribute to Beckley, who did pass away after the filming of the first movie, which is why I'm not sure how the second movie kind of goes. I think it's When a Stranger Calls Back. I think it might just be a whole new killer. I honestly don't know. I have not seen it or really looked into it, but it's definitely on my list of movies to watch. But if you have seen this movie, I'm interested to know what you think. Do you think it deserves to be on the list? What did you think of that opening scene? Did it terrify you just as much as it did me? And do you kind of feel like the rest of the movie feels kind of disconnected, or did you actually enjoy the way the story was told? I'm always interested to see what you guys have to say. You can leave a comment down below or head over to my Instagram, What a Horror. I'm going to be making a post about this video as well. I appreciate you guys for watching. Please like and subscribe if you want to see more of these kind of videos. And until next time, stay spooky.